You know, just about the time that you think that you have heard and seen it all of a sudden there comes along a story that is so bizarre, so unreal, and so breathtaking, all of a sudden you realize you haven't. This is a true story. It takes place back in 1999, deals with a man by the name of Ron Shanenberger. Ron Shanenberger had, on Father's Day, gotten up, was going to go in and take a shower, and he told his wife, go in and I want you to wake up our little 7-month-old son, Tyler. Now, normally that's what Ron would do, but on this day, he wanted his wife to do it. And so his wife, Amy, walks into the room where their little boy is at. There he is in the crib. And she finds him lying face down in the bed, stiff and cold. She screams as any mother would, and Ron tells her, he says, call 911. And so that's what she did. The doctors examined the little boy's body, and they came to the conclusion that he had died of SIDS. Now, for those of you who don't know what SIDS is, it's sudden infant death syndrome. That was their determination. A couple, 3 days later, they buried their little boy. A few hours after the funeral, Amy, his wife, is sitting there in their living room, and she's sobbing and weeping as any mother would. And she's kind of put herself on a guilt trip because normally when she would have come home on that Saturday night before Father's Day, she would have gone in and checked on their little boy, but she was so tired and so exhausted that when she came home, she just immediately went to bed and didn't worry about it, but she was beating herself over that. Well, her husband Ron comes in and he begins to tell her a very unbelievable story. And here's how the story goes. As he's sitting there looking at his wife, he says, last night, I took a piece of plastic wrap as our little boy was laying there in the crib playing with his feet, and I wrapped it around his head. I went in, I ate dinner, I brushed my teeth, I went back into the room to see him take his last breath. I unwrapped the plastic from his head, put him on his stomach, pulled the covers up, and I went to bed. Amy is sitting there in total horror and shock. And she asked him one question. She said, why? And here was his response. Now we're even. And again, a look of horror and shock on her face. And she says to him, she said, what do you mean we're even? And here was his response. He said, you remember when you went on that ocean cruise with your mother and father, and my dad passed away, and you refused to cut your cruise short and come home and comfort me? He said, I decided right then that I was going to marry you, we were going to have a child, and I was going to kill that child. We're even. She couldn't believe it. But ask yourself the question, what could cause such wreckage and carnage to be left behind? A little 7-month-old baby boy, innocent, now dead. A marriage broken. A wife and a mother sitting in a living room shattered. And a husband and a father, well, facing at least a 49-year prison sentence. What could have caused such wreckage and carnage? One word describes it all, and it is the word bitterness. We've been dealing over these last couple of weeks, a series of messages, with the feelings of being overwhelmed. And sometimes as we go through this life, it seems like life is just too much. It seems like life is trying to draw more out of the account than it is in the account. And so we find ourselves overwhelmed by various circumstances and situations. When we get overwhelmed, whatever it might be, it has an effect upon us, relationship-wise, financially, emotionally, but most importantly, spiritually. I've talked about being overwhelmed by guilt. I've talked about being overwhelmed by stress. So if you have your Bibles this morning, go with me, if you would, to the book of Hebrews in chapter 12. Hebrews in chapter 12, because I want to deal with the issue of being overwhelmed with bitterness. Now, there's a couple things you need to understand about bitter people. Bitter people not only hurt others, but really more importantly, bitter people hurt themselves more really than they hurt others. And the unfortunate thing is that bitter people want to be bitter. And so they come to a point in time in their life where they believe, I have the right to be bitter. This survey is probably 6, 7, maybe even 8 years old. The Journal of Adult Development. They came out with some facts that I thought were kind of interesting. And it said this: 73% of those who were surveyed said that they believed that God had forgiven them for past wrongs and mistakes. Okay? 73%. 52% said that they had forgiven others of wrongs that they had done to them. But only 43% said that they have actively sought the forgiveness of others for those whom they had done wrong. Only 43% actively sought forgiveness. What is bitterness? And I'm going to give you a very simple definition of what it is. It is a harbored hurt hidden in the heart. Very simply defined, and you can find a lot of other definitions, but that's the perspective I'm going to come from. It is a harbored hurt that is hidden in the heart. The writer of Hebrews here comes along and deals with the reality not only of bitterness, that it exists, but also lays out how we remove bitterness out of our life. And my hope and my prayer, if you're sitting here this morning listening to me, or you're watching by way of the internet, and you've got bitterness in your life, I hope that before the day is over with, that you'll make a decision that you're going to get it out of your life. But I want to share with you this morning 3 things that we must do if we're going to remove bitterness from our life. Number 1 is this: we must get to the heart of our bitterness. Okay? You got to get to the heart of it. Look at Hebrews chapter 12. Look at verse 15. Here's how the writer describes it. He says, "See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God." Here it is. "That no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled." Now notice what the writer says about bitterness and how he describes it. He says it's a root. You think about your plants, whether you're talking about a flower or a bush or whatever it is. All plants have roots. Where are the roots? Well, they're just below the surface of the ground, all right? You see the plant, but most of the time you do not see the root. But the root, even though, as you're looking at the plant, seems to be invisible, the root is still there. The plant could not grow without the root. Well, he says that, guess what? Bitterness has a root. Now, you may not be able to see that root, but what does that root do? It buries itself, bores itself down deep into the soil. Guess what bitterness does? Bitterness bores itself down deep into the soil of the heart. You may not be able to see it, but it is never far from the lips of our life. And it's boring itself the longer we refuse to deal with it. It continues to bore itself deeper and deeper down into the soil of the heart. Now, in life's journey, we all have been hurt. And if you haven't, just wait, it'll happen. I would like to be able to say it won't happen, but it will happen. Sometimes the hurt is intentional. Somebody literally wants to do something bad to you. Sometimes it's unintentional. People will do things and don't know that what they said or what they did, offended you or hurt you in some way. However, sometimes the hurt that we're experiencing is imagined. Nobody really has said or done anything wrong to you, but you have convinced yourself that they have. Now, whether it's intentional or unintentional, whether it's imagined or not, nevertheless, the hurt is real. But the reality is that the only way you can begin to deal with the issue of bitterness is that you have to deal with the root. And again, as you examine and you look at bitter people, what happens? Over a period of time, they began to justify the reason for why they are bitter. Now, you can try to talk them out of it, but I guarantee you, you're not going to talk them out of it. They have come to their logical conclusion as to why they have the right to be bitter. Because here's what will happen. When somebody gets wrong, when you get wrong and you don't deal with it, what happens? You dwell on it. You begin to think about it. And what happens is you become critical, you become negative, and you're looking for the faults in that person's life. Okay? Bitterness is not something that you can see, but I guarantee you, you will always see its fruit. You may not see the root of bitterness, folks, but I guarantee you in your life, you will always see the root. And the reason why it needs to be dealt with is because bitterness is a problem of the heart. And so the writer, as he begins to write here about how do we get rid of it, is you've got to get to the root problem. Now, think about this. You have weeds in your garden. You can go out there in your garden, and you can just clip what you see, the top of the plant off, and think to yourself, I've got it solved. I've got it taken care of. No, you haven't, because you haven't dealt with the root. Any of you ever had to deal with dandelions? Okay? I think we probably all have. Well, guess what? If you do not pull that dandelion up by the root, you can cut it off at the ground level. I guarantee you, give it a few days, it's going to be right back. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is talking about. When it comes to bitterness, you can't just take the top of it off. You have to go to the root problem. What caused the bitterness? So we must get to the heart of the problem. But secondly, he says, if you look there back at verse 15, that we have to see the hurt of our bitterness. Here's what he says. That no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble. Bitterness causes problems. It causes troubles. It affects relationships. All right? It'll affect your relationship with God. It'll affect your relationship with others. And one of the things that I think sometimes bitter people don't understand, it affects your relationship with yourself. Because you have this inward conflict that is the result of some kind of external conflict that took place. So let me show you 4 ways that bitterness affects us. Number 1 is that it affects us mentally. Okay? It affects us mentally. You ever found yourself in a situation where you're in a conversation with somebody and you're trying to think, they're talking to you about this person and you're trying to think of that person's name? I found myself in that kind of conversation this week. Okay? And neither one of us, as we were talking about this individual, could remember what his name was. We knew who we were talking about, but we were both there and could not. What is his name? What is his name? And probably for 30 minutes we went on like that. Well, I came back to my office, and I'm sitting in there in my office, and I don't think that Charlene heard me. All of a sudden I said, and I called the guy by name. I finally remembered. Okay? Well, guess what? When it comes to bitterness, our brains work the same way. We may think we have forgotten it, but in reality we haven't. It's still there. And every once in a while something happens, and all of a sudden that circumstance, that individual, man, they come flying back into our minds. In order to get rid of bitterness, folks, we got to understand it will affect us mentally. But secondly, it will affect us emotionally. Doctors tell us that when people are bitter and hate and all that, it really kind of acts like a depressant. Okay? And again, the idea is that they're negative, they're critical, they're fault-finding. And they don't understand they probably do understand, but they won't admit to it. But they also deal with depression. I heard one author describe it this way. Bitter people are like porcupines. They got a lot of good points. You just can't get close to them. And that's true if you've ever been around a bitter person. Emotionally, they can't connect with other people. And the reason is because emotionally, they are disconnected in their heart. You know, they may want to, they may like to, but till they deal with the issue of bitterness, it just isn't going to happen. But bitter people are also, they're unforgiving and they're ungrateful. And it is hard for us to be grateful to God for what He has done for us when we are still harboring that attitude of bitterness towards somebody else who has hurt us. How in the world can you be grateful to God for what He's done and you got this person over here that you still can't stand? That if they were to walk in the same room that you were in, good chances are you might walk out of. And for some of us, if they walked in the same room we were in and they got close enough to us, we might just want to punch their lights out. How can you be grateful for God and still maintain this attitude over here? Guess what? You can't. So it affects us mentally, it affects us emotionally, and here's the third way it affects us. It affects us physically. Doctors tell us that physiologically, bitterness affects us in a variety of different ways. In fact, they've kind of done a little study and said, you know, it affects us in about 50 different ways. Sometimes it's ulcers, sometimes it's high blood pressure, sometimes it's other things. Now, if you're here this morning or you're listening to me and you have ulcers or you have high blood pressure, I'm not suggesting that you are dealing with bitterness. I'm just saying those can be results of bitterness, okay? Those can be results of being bitter. But the last way that it affects us, really, for me, is the most important way. And that is that it affects us spiritually. Look at what the writer writes there in verses 14 and 15. He says, "Pursue peace with all men and the sanctification or holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God." A bitter person does not have peace on the inside. They are in a constant state of turmoil. Now, it may not reflect itself outwardly. A lot of times it will, but not always. But a bitter person, I guarantee you, if they get honest with you, they are not at peace inside. But here's what else happens. They will not look to God, they will not love God, and they will not live for God the way they should because they're bitter. And a lot of times, that bitterness, guess where it gets directed back to? God. If God really loved me, He wouldn't have allowed this to happen. He wouldn't have allowed this to take place. Why is it? Just kind of a rhetorical question. Why is it that it seems like when bad things happen to us, it's always God's fault? We want to blame Him. You know, I had a friend of mine, he was driving down the interstate, and he was running about 85. And for those of you who have driven between St. Louis and Kansas City, there's 3 spots along Interstate 70 that the Missouri Highway Patrol is well known for setting up radar traps. Montgomery City, between Columbia and Boonville, and then out about Harrisonville. They like to set up radar traps there. So my friend was making this trip, and I told him, I said, when you get to Columbia, you better drive the speed limit from Columbia to the other side of Boonville, because if you don't, somewhere along in there, they're going to have radar. I'll guarantee you. I'll be okay. He's flying along 85 miles an hour. Guess what? He got pulled over. And when we were talking about it, here's the interesting thing. When he was talking to me about it, he said, I don't understand, why God would let this happen to me. And here's my question. Was God driving the car? No. God wasn't driving the car, you were. And yet in life, unfortunately, it seems like things happen and we want to blame God. God is not to blame for all the things that go wrong in our life. In fact, If you look down there in verse 15, the last part of that verse, here's what he says. He says, and by it, meaning bitterness, many be defiled. And so because of the bitterness in our life, guess what? As I said a moment ago, it not only affects us, but it affects other people, whether we intend for it to or not. So if we're going to get bitterness out of life, we have to get to the root problem. We have to recognize the hurt. But here's the third thing. You got to remove the hate of bitterness. Okay? You must remove the hate of bitterness. Go back to verse 15. He says, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. If you never deal with the root problem, folks, you'll never get rid of bitterness. You have to deal with the root. The root has to be plucked out. And I'm not suggesting this morning that is an easy thing to do. I can speak from experience on that. You know, through my ministry, there are things that have happened that have hurt me deeply, and I didn't instantly get over it. And when I said a moment ago, if certain people had walked into the room, you would wanted to punch them in the face. At one point in time, and Beth can attest to this, that's exactly where I was at because of something that happened, because of a lie that was told about me. And if that person had been within arm shot of me, I guarantee you I would have tried to abduct him. Now, is that the right attitude to have? No, but I'm just telling you this morning, I'm speaking from experience. I know what I'm talking about. Okay? It's not an easy thing to deal with. But here's the two things that you have to do if you're going to get rid of it. Number one is, you got to forget it. You got to forget it. You got to take whatever it is, okay, and you identify it for yourself, whatever it is, and you got to go place that in an unmarked grave, and you got to figure out, and you got to remember, you must not remember where you planted it. You got to forget it. Here's how Paul puts it over in the book of Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31, he says this. He says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. The key words there is that little phrase, put away. That means to dispose of. It means to discard. It means to get rid of. You've got to get rid of that I'm going to get even feeling. Because most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, when we've been hurt, what do we want to do? We want to hurt that person back. And really, truth be known, we want to hurt them worse than what they hurt us. That's human. That's the sinful human nature, unfortunately. Bitterness. You have to begin to forget it. Outside of Jesus, there probably was no one who was more unfairly treated and maybe had more reason to be bitter than the Old Testament character Joseph. Think about Joseph for a moment. What was his problem? His problem was his other brothers. They had become jealous of him because in their eyes, they thought, Dad loves him more than he loves us. Now, whether that's true or not, okay, isn't the issue. But that jealousy turned to bitterness. And so one day they decided, let's throw him in a pit and leave him to die. And then one of the brothers had this brilliant idea. No, wait a minute. We can make some money off of this. Let's sell Joseph as a slave. So they got 30 pieces of silver for selling Joseph. And Joseph is hauled off down to Egypt. And down in Egypt, what happens to Joseph? He gets falsely accused of rape and is sentenced to 15 years in prison. Now, ultimately, God rescues him and restores him. But here's where the story gets really interesting. He married an Egyptian woman. He has 2 sons. The first son's name is Manasseh. You know what that name literally means? Remembering no more. The second son's name is Ephraim. And Ephraim's name literally means success. And so when Joseph is looking at those 2 boys, he is reminded of the fact that God has taken the sting out of those old memories. And he's looking at those 2 boys, and he's no longer remembering what has happened to him. He's remembering what God has done for him and how God has made him successful. So we got to forget it. Secondly, we have to forgive it. Look down there, if you would, at verse 15. In verse 15, it says this: fails to obtain the grace of God. Bitterness, folks, it is a cancer. And the reason why bitterness is one of the most dangerous of all the emotions that we can have as human beings is this, is that it can destroy the container in which it is in. It's a cancer. It's a cancer that will eat you alive, that will make your life miserable until you deal with it. And so when you look at what the writer says there in the last part of that verse, here's what he says: until we come to the cross of Jesus, and we remember how God has forgiven us, we will not forgive others. Till we come to the cross. And we're reminded of how God has forgiven us. We're not going to forgive others. See, we need to realize and experience the grace of God in our life. And as we do that, then guess what? We have the ability to begin to forgive others for wrongs that have happened to us. Whether they ever come and acknowledge and say, I was wrong for doing that, I'm sorry, can I have your forgiveness? Charles Spurgeon, the great 19th century preacher, he said it this way. He said, go to the cross to learn how you have been forgiven, and then stay a while to learn how to forgive. I love that. Go to the cross, learn how you've been forgiven, stay there for a while, and learn how to forgive. But I want you to notice something else. Go back to verse 14 with me. First part of that verse. Here's what he says: pursue peace with all men. Pursue peace with all men. And you need to understand something in the Greek about that word pursue. It means to go after in aggressive fashion. To go after it. That's what it means to pursue. Go after in a progressive fashion. So if you're a bitter person, here's what needs to happen. You have to initiate the end of the war. You've got to pull the defenses down. You've got to rebuild the bridge. And you've got to begin to restore the relationships. And we need to understand that there is absolutely no way those things can happen apart from the grace of God. There are two people required for forgiveness: you and Jesus. Not you and somebody else. You and Jesus, because the only way we can forgive is by the grace of God. What is forgiveness? And again, let me give you a very simple definition. It is giving up my right to hurt you because you have hurt me. That's what forgiveness is. Giving up my right to hurt you because you have hurt me. And you've got two choices this morning. You can either be full of bitterness but empty of Jesus. Or you can be full of Jesus and empty of bitterness. But please hear me very carefully. You cannot be both. It's one way or the other. You're either full of bitterness and empty of Jesus, or you're full of Jesus and empty of bitterness. You want to live a life as a forgiving person? You want to die as a forgiven person? Well, guess what? It all goes back to the grace of God. It cannot happen any other way other than by God's grace. And when you begin to talk about people being bitter, oftentimes people will say, well, you don't know how badly I've been hurt. You're right. I don't need to know how badly you've been hurt. But God does. And God understands it. And I want you to think about something. If you're one of those persons who's saying, you don't know how badly I've been hurt, Think about how badly God was hurt because of your sin and my sin, and His Son went to the cross and suffered and died for you and me. Is there any greater hurt than that? I don't think so. And yet God lovingly sent His Son, and Jesus willingly went to the cross. And it is because of that grace that there is hope. And so this morning, my question is, where are you at in life's journey? What has you overwhelmed that you can't handle? Have you brought it to the cross of Jesus Christ and laid it down upon Him? And for some of you this morning, that point, that reference point, is coming to the point of accepting and receiving Christ as your Savior. That's the starting point for some of you this morning. For others of us, we're at different journeys in our Christian life. But we know this much. I'm not as full of Jesus as what I need to be. I don't love Him the way I should. I don't look to Him the way I should. I don't necessarily live for Him the way I should. But today is going to be a different day. And I'm going to recommit myself that He's going to be in control. He's going to be in charge of how my life is going to be lived. Father, as we come to this invitation, Lord, You've been in our midst. You've spoken. Now comes the time for us to decide, are we going to act? And Father, it's not necessarily whether anybody walks down this aisle that's important. It's what happens in the heart. And Lord, all of us this morning, we have decisions to make. We have things that have happened in the past that we just need to let go of and get rid of and just give it to You, Father, and forget it and forgive it as You have forgiven us. So my prayer, Lord, is in these moments, as we have this invitation, whatever Your desire is to have happen, Father, that Your name will be glorified. And Father, we will be obedient as Your people. And I ask these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.